Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. In this episode, we're joined by Hannah and Sarah from Edge Urban Design, where we will be talking about, urban design, how we can approach new development in a more sustainable way and make it respond to local considerations and characteristics. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you both for joining us today. Absolutely fantastic to see you again in the flesh. We were just saying how long it's been since we've seen each other. It's been a couple of years since we met up, so it's really nice to be able to catch up with you again in person. So you guys are both from Edge Urban Design. Wonderful to see you. And I was wondering if we could maybe start by talking a bit about what urban design actually is.
It's a very good question. I think everybody has a different definition of urban design, and it probably means something different to every person who works within urban design. I don't know what your definition would be, Sarah.
My definition, yeah, you are always. It's a lot. I would describe it, because even people in the industry, like you say, don't even really quite understand what it is. Even architects, landscape architects. I would say that it's about creating places and spaces for people, and we are dealing with both the built environment and the natural environment, and I guess finding ways of making those come together in the best possible way.
Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, to add to that, it's about the spaces between the buildings and how the buildings hang together, but also strategically how we think about landscape and routes and streets and squares and community. But I think actually the more and more that we do our job, the more we realise that our job is actually about communication, and it's about advocacy and trying to take people on the journey. So really, I think we found ourselves to be more like storytellers rather than actually.
That's a nice way of putting it, though.
Yeah, I think we are kind of strategic storytellers.
So of course we care about the detail, and we look at things both at a small scale and large scale. And from what we do at Edge, it is predominantly lots of sort of residential development and working, with the environment to deliver much needed housing, particularly in this country. We do care about the detail, and we want places that ultimately will come forward and will be beautiful places. But the majority of what we're concerned about is the kind of overall spatial planning and making sure that uses function together with each other, that that there's connectivity between existing places, new places, safe places for children to walk, play. So there's not, like an architect, I guess, is so often very much about the detail and exactly how you create even just small elements, how they all come together. We want to make sure that the bigger picture is really nailed and thought about.
And quite honestly, the detail wouldn't be able to come forward if the planning strategy wasn't right, if we weren't looking at things that are in the right place, and if we hadn't nailed that story right from the outset. So I think very much we've become storytellers because that's the way that we've managed to achieve success in what we do. As long as we can tell it right from the outset, then we can follow through with the detail as a project moves forward.
That's a really good way of putting it. It's funny because we talked earlier a bit about the relationship between landscape and urban design, because I often just say the role of landscape architects is to articulate the narrative of other professions, and it's all about that kind of collaborative role. And what you guys do is so similar to that. In principle, it's much the same thing, isn't it? And that's kind of where some of my confusion, because I studied landscape and urban design, and I still don't entirely understand the relationship between and the difference between the two kind of disciplines in a sense. But obviously there is quite a clear distinction, and I think to me it's kind of more scale. Potentially, would you agree? Or?
Yeah, and I do think it probably depends on what background you come from. So for example, within Edge, we are all designers of sorts, but we've actually all come from very different backgrounds. So my background was originally architecture. Hannah's was architecture and landscape. We have members of the team that have actually come from interior design and sort of public space, sort of exhibition type ideas. So and fashion.
Oh, really?
So
that's interesting.
We all come with creative minds, and I think that's what's really key about what we do. I think what sets Edge apart from perhaps many other practices that offer urban design is that we are bespokely urban design. So we all have all these professional backgrounds and sort of understanding, and we use that to help us articulate what we do without focusing on it. Whereas I guess I would say our competitors might be architectural practices that offer urban design. So they are very much coming from probably the built form side. You have landscape architects that offer urban design and come therefore from a very landscape sort of driven perspective. And then you have the multidisciplinary practices that might even be more on the engineering side of things. So I think depending on where your passions have come from and where your expertise lies, does change how you therefore approach a project. And I think what we found in being a bespokely urban design practice and having to generate new clients and get them to really gain an insight and interest in what we do, they have started to recognise how we approach things quite differently.
And yeah, also I guess we don't come from a planning background either. So design-led urban design is very different from planning-led urban design, which is often taught at lots of universities. So the beauty of our team is that everybody is design-led, but from a slightly different background. And I think that really makes for proper urban design that really understands a place rather than it doesn't really get under the nitty-gritty, kind of under the surface, which you can find with some planning-led type approaches.
I suppose it can become a bit formulaic, can't it, when it's more planning-led? Because it's more zoning, I suppose, isn't it? Whereas you guys are probably a bit more detailed than that, but not as detailed as perhaps architects and landscape architects might be. So you kind of have like a really good middle ground sort of between the two to sort of think about it a bit more holistically, maybe.
I think what's really important, and I think we're learning it more and more about what we do, is that actually our role in any project, regardless of scale, whether it's, you know, a very small cluster of new houses through right to sort of new settlements that we're designing, we have to have, and we are having to learn continually about everything. I think a lot of the disciplines we work with, because clearly we have to work with lots of technical kind of disciplines such as flooding experts, highways engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, heritage, archaeology consultants. So clearly we're not experts in all those fields, but we have to understand that they all influence what we ultimately output, because not only do we want to do something creative that fits within the planning system or might be trying to test the planning system a little bit as well to be a bit more forward thinking, we are also very much grounded in the reality and the viability of and being robust and be able to deliver something going forward.
And I think as part of that, though, we also have to be prepared to challenge our colleagues that we collaborate with if we think there potentially is another way of doing something, or ask the question of, well, that's great that that's the technical solution. However, could we try this? Would this work?
But I think that's because they are very silo in the way that they work, whereas we can't be.
Well, no, we have to think strategically. So being able to see that strategic picture and kind of balance out and spin all the plates with all the consultant team gives us the ability to have that holistic approach towards design and creating places, which I don't think necessarily all other disciplines would be able to kind of deal with from that point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, the siloed issue. I think that's why landscape and urban design is kind of, and you get terms like landscape urbanism and things like that, where it's kind of more kind of joined together as a specific thing opposed to the two separate kind of professions. And again, I still do see a lot of similarities between the two of them. I mean, because a lot of what we get involved with is, we don't do much master planning in our practice, but we do a lot of various landscape schemes of varying sizes, and quite often we'll find that an engineer will be involved and they will give you the solution to the flooding issue, which may not chime with the rest of the layout or doesn't really fit in with the landscape or whatever. And then you have the architects come in and they'll say, well, this is where the buildings are going. And actually, I think part of what people are starting to realise and why it's sort of shifting to this more sort of landscape and urban design focused kind of solutions is that we know that we need to sort of look at a site totally differently and go, what's there now and how do we work with what's there at the minute, and how do we enhance that, and then where does all the infrastructure and the buildings and things like that go?
I think it actually goes a step further, and that's where we would come in. Where has that place been in the past, and therefore where is it now? And then the next therefore being, how should it be shaped in the future? Knowing all of that background, that's something that we tend to work into a lot with our work.
Yeah, we really try to understand the history of a place, the local character, and be that down to the kind of the urban grain, like how has this place grown over time, the street formations, the types of buildings that are there, the materials that are used. Because it's not about trying to then create a pastiche of what's been done in the past, but it's like, how do you build on that and how do you make a positive addition? Because I think we all are accepting of and know that we need to continue to grow. We do need to provide housing and other uses throughout the country. And we also know from past experience that that has been done in a negative way or in a poor way. And I think that's where a lot of people's misconceptions with some of the stuff that we do might come from. That all development is bad, but I don't think that's the case. I think if you can really explain why you're doing, and actually that it's a good way of doing it, it's a positive thing for that community or creating a new community, then that's also that's like really lovely about what we do when we do a lot of community engagement with certain projects, to be able to turn people's mindsets around. You know, NIMBYism is such a big thing in this country, and many people you're not going to at all convince that what we're doing is good. But when you have those few glimmers of hope, when you can really explain that, you know, we are really trying to understand what is needed and listening to your views, that's really positive. So as well, so going back to, as well as having, you know, looking at context and historical assessments, we are always very driven by landscape in our projects, and we kind of work from the landscape up.
Yeah.
So using existing, you know, you might call them constraints. I don't think landscape is necessarily a constraint, but using that to help shape what we come forward. So the protection, enhancement of existing vegetation, obviously really thinking about landform, and the ecological merits that a site has, and enhancing that even further, which clearly is becoming a much bigger issue as well to tackle. But that's what really helps ground us in creating a place that then fits where it's being proposed.
Yeah.
But that all goes back to storytelling and perception. The history starts there. So often the history gives us the clues about where a place should go, but it also gives us that narrative and storytelling that we can talk to the local communities about. And likewise with the landscape and ecology and biodiversity, taking the cues from the existing place and protecting that character that's already there makes it a known kind of entity. Whereas if you were to wipe out all of the existing hedgerows on a site, you've taken away the character. And then people don't recognise it anymore. So that's why it's so important to keep all of that and to tell that story and build it up so that other people understand why we do the things that we do and what it means, to try and kind of relay some of the negative connotations that they have with development, which I think is a really interesting and difficult challenge for all of us in the profession to deal with. We've been looking recently at the difference between urban extensions and new settlements, and actually, is it better to look at new settlements in terms of perception and community engagement? Because there's a different kind of way that people take ownership of something that's down their street. Whereas if it's kind of a mile or 2 miles down the road, you don't necessarily have exactly the same connection with it because you don't see it every day.
Yeah.
And obviously there are many other benefits to creating new places because you're not sweating the assets of a place or increasing the traffic on somebody's street or on their front door. And actually it allows us to go much further in creating successful places. So that's kind of been a really interesting recent kind of endeavour for us that's very much been led by the pandemic. Because actually we have to start thinking about creating places now in a completely different way. And that's a really interesting progression for everyone in the profession.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and you know, people's values have changed so much on where they want to live and what they want places to be like. So how have you found that then? What have you found that people tend to chime more to an extension or a new settlement? Because I suppose, you know, you get people kind of looking at it like, oh, but it's part of our city or whatever, whereas opposed to it's their community over there and they kind of want to be quite separate from it. Is that kind of a similar kind of response to what you've had, or is it people prefer to see something not where they are? They don't want something in their backyard, they want something
I don't think there's, I mean, I think people just overall don't like change, and that's completely understandable. Nobody really wants to see development anywhere.
That doesn't surprise me.
Until they kind of understand that, you know, their kids need somewhere to live, or they end up ultimately probably moving there themselves when they realise that it's not that bad. But most of the UK has been burnt by some of the development we've had in the 80s, 90s, noughties, and the bad kind of...
And I think the problem is that going back to this idea of that you're touching on whether extensions versus new settlements are nice or better, good, is that we've had so much piecemeal development. And the problem is if you have 10 lots of 100 houses tacked on over time, which each in their own right don't provide enough weight to really deliver the other benefits that you need, the settlement has still grown by 1,000 new dwellings. Whereas if you'd have sort of done 1,000 dwellings, actually there would have been that kind of weight behind it to deliver more schools, probably doctor's surgery, all that sort of thing. So the piecemeal development, as much as there still obviously is a place for it and a need for it, because not all places do need to grow, and they're not going to all grow by an entire strategic extension or new settlement. But it's about trying to get people to understand that actually there is an alternative as well.
Yeah.
And we've also seen in settlements in Oxfordshire, as an example, where the local community has resisted development. They've ended up missing out on getting that community infrastructure because they're just pushing back. We don't want anything. So inevitably, they've ended up with no facilities, but lots and lots of growth. And that's a real shame that that's happened. And actually, there hasn't been a way to engage with people.
Yeah, it's true. It's a real challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's very difficult because I often think in that kind of similar kind of mindset of these large scale developments. But at the moment, I'm trying to build a house in Surrey. And we have an amazing plot of land, which is already covered in structures and all of this type of thing. And it's a bit run down. It really could do with improving, and building a property on it, in our view, kind of makes sense because it's kind of, enhancing the site. But you can also see it from kind of the planning side, where they're kind of, because it's slightly outside the settlement, they're kind of like, we don't want any more development in the countryside. And I think that's one of the things I come across a lot now, is a lot of people are sort of saying, well, they're building 1,000 homes down the road or 100 homes down the road, but we've got this bit of land next to existing houses with all the utilities here, and actually we can't, we can't do anything with it. And I think that's a real challenge. It's interesting to see how the government's kind of responding, because they're putting a lot more effort into sort of self-builds and trying to relax some of the rules around that. And there are obviously places for that, but then again, you end up with that kind of piecemeal, infilly type situation, whereas in the countryside, maybe it's not so appropriate. I mean, I think it's appropriate in my case, but, you can understand why they don't always look upon it so favourably. But I think that can also cause a lot of this kind of issue around, especially smaller communities, where you get a lot of pushback, because you get a lot of small communities that go, well, actually, we've got spaces here that are doable. Why are we not doing anything with them? Or why can't we? Yet something can be built down the road. And it's part of that. That's part of the kind of bigger discussion and kind of challenge that is kind of, there at the moment, I think.
I think that's a really difficult one to deal with, though, because often it will be an ownership issue, or for some reason it can't come forward. It's the same with kind of empty shops on the high street. Sometimes you can't contact the owners to fill the shops up.
Absolutely.
So it's way more complicated than people think it is. And people will always have that judgment that we should be doing brownfield first, we should fill the empty shops first. Sometimes it technically isn't possible to do that. And it's kind of having that open mind, but people will always push back about, on not here, no change. And there's a really interesting piece of work for us to do in the UK of changing that perception, and how we do that, I'm not entirely sure. But, thinking about the behavioural psychology of why people don't like change. What is that? I don't have the answer.
No, but I think partly it's because sometimes the opportunity for change is clearly visible, yet it's not necessarily always being acted on. I think your point is absolutely right about some of these brownfield sites. So we're here in Birmingham at the moment. I live on the southwestern side of Birmingham, and just driving here into the centre, you pass a huge amount of sort of derelict sites and rundown buildings and all this type of thing. And the east side of Birmingham is in the middle of a huge regeneration push, because lots of that's derelict. And you see that, but then you see a new development going in the countryside, and immediately people are like, well, why haven't they done something with that? And I think that's part of the challenge. And as you said, it's absolutely not that straightforward. It is a very difficult challenge, because some of those areas are, land banks, essentially, where people are storing money, waiting for areas to be developed and all this type of thing.
The challenges come from, up to sort of governmental level as well, and politics, and we might want to drive something, but if there might be much bigger hurdles to overcome than we'd want. And there is a misconception as to even whether it's a brownfield site or a greenfield site, what we do. I think a lot of people don't actually understand the process that goes behind it. And particularly when you go through consultation strategies with local residents, stakeholders and things, and you really have to try and explain to them, there's a misconception as to how long these things take. So the delivery of what we're proposing is too long as well. And that's, and not necessarily by fault of developers or us that work in the profession. A lot of it is down to local authorities and, top level as well. And that isn't something that's going to change overnight. All that we can do, I guess, is really to try and kind of be positive about it and move forward as best we can and advocate for good change.
And I think part of that is the planning process, because what people are seeing being built now, so the bricks that, and the spade in the ground now, could be planning from 20 years ago, because we're not delivering homes. So there are many, many schemes that we've both worked on that haven't got out of the ground, and they're still not there yet. Because of viability, because of changes, because of the planning process. And so therefore the public perception is that they're seeing something that's probably 20 years out of date, and the design is out of date, the technologies are out of date, sustainability is out of date, but it's still allowed to come forward, which of course it is, but it doesn't really help us in that kind of moving forward with a good perception of development.
No, it is very difficult. I mean, some of the projects we're involved with, which are sort of, blocks of flats essentially, quite interesting ones, but, some of them have been in planning for 3 years now, and we've been working on them since we started as a practice, and they're still not through planning. And you just think, my gosh, it's such a...
3 years. I mean, we have schemes, or I have schemes I've worked on that take 10 years just to get through planning, and then you've got the whole legal process before you then go through the next stage of planning to get the detailed design. So you're looking at, in some cases, 10 plus years before the spade hits the ground, and at which point technologies have changed, needs of the community have changed, because other development may or may not have come forward. It may be more acute than it even was at that point. Like, it's a bit of a defunct system, to say the least. We try to test the status quo occasionally, but then it very much depends on also how forward-thinking, various clients that you work with and how they want to be able to address that as well.
That's it. Yeah, and you also have to view it from the developer side, because when something's taken that long, they've invested potentially millions in a project which still is yet to even begin. So it immediately creates a reluctance to do any more to it when having already spent so much time and money on these things.
That's another problem with the public perception, thinking these are greedy developers, they're making loads of money, but actually I don't think anyone ever understands how much money they've spent to get to that point. It's a phenomenal amount of money that it costs to go through that process.
Absolutely.
And people just think they're money grabbers, but it's not like that at all.
No, that's it. I mean, I can attest to this. Again, I don't want to talk about it too much, but the house we're trying to build, the initial estimates we got back for just planning was £30,000. And you think, my God, that's so much money.
And that's one house.
That's one house, exactly. And
you're taking a risk.
Yeah,
and that's what developers do every day, and promoters, they take a risk. Sometimes it doesn't come off.
Yeah, indeed. Exactly. And you have to allow for that. And it's a very difficult situation. But then you also get some, I won't name them, but there was one recently where they announced sort of their the bonuses to some of the executives, and it worked out as something like £10,000 on every home for one specific developer, and not one of the good ones. You can probably guess, but and that again, it kind of helps cause this sort of disenfranchisedness of kind of the sector, because people see that much more readily than they see good design. You always hear the bad side of the story, don't you? You never hear the good side of the story. I was
going to say, the press aren't going to pick up the good side.
No.
About how many badgers have been saved and where they've got their new set. It's all going to be about how much money people have made.
That's it.
It's a much better story, isn't it?
It is, yeah,
Apparently.
absolutely. And we were talking about some of this last week. We were saying, that actually people have this. There's also one of the big perceptions is you're destroying the countryside. It's you're destroying nature and all these type of things. Where actually, a lot of it can be improved. People see a farmer's field or a series of fields, and you think, this green, rural paradise. Whereas actually they're completely sterile. A lot of these fields, and actually produce, even though there's houses built on it, if they've got gardens and planted areas and avenues of trees, that's much better than the field would have been in its own right. So you
have the ability to enhance the actual biodiversity value.
Exactly. Yeah.
But also you're giving people access to that space, because all this countryside that we have is privately owned and it's inaccessible. So yes, we can view it when we drive down the road, or there may be a public footpath that runs through it, and you get a view, but you don't actually have true access to it.
Yeah.
And so yes, you might be building on it and delivering, whether it's houses, whether it's commercial, whatever it may be, you are then given the opportunity to enhance it even further. You know, when we propose developments and we have to put in sort of flood alleviation strategies, you know, you can plant those up and you can create new habitats, and so you are inviting wildlife, flora, fauna, enhancing all that, and that wouldn't happen, like you say, if it was just churned year on year out as an agricultural field, for example.
Exactly, and you do see that with some of the new settlements and developments that are being done. I'm from Basingstoke originally, and there's a lot of urban extension going on there. And you know, some of the new areas that are being developed, they've got big parks in, like sweeping all the way around the new development to kind of separate it from any future development and create a better sort of integration with the surrounding landscape, and also provide that access for people to go and walk and explore and have animals right up to their, you know, right up to the sort of settlement edge, you know, cows and sheep and things like that. So people are able to engage more readily with that kind of rural, you know, world.
Yeah, definitely.
I think going back to the question about the press and how the story is told about development, I'll just bring back what we were saying earlier about the new builds are coming, because the idea of that programme was to actually show the story behind development so that people could understand all the work that goes into the process and actually kind of have that little open window on the industry. And I think it was really, really interesting because people suddenly came up to us and said, I didn't know that you did all of that. Like, oh, that's really interesting. Is that how much work goes into what you do? Yeah. and actually, if anything, from that programme, it's quite a long time ago now, but it just gave people an idea of, or educated them in actually what does happen in our industry and what the challenges are that we face. And, you know, that it's not all a bad news story, that actually there's some really great things that happen.
No, absolutely. So this was a show that was on the BBC, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, BBC Two.
Yeah, and this was, and as you say, it was all about kind of the process that we go through. And I remember watching it and thinking, you know, it's really interesting because, again, as you say, you just don't see how much work goes into a lot of these projects, especially now, and it's getting, you know, more and more and more is being done prior to, you know, a project actually getting in the ground, as we've already kind of said, to try and make it suitable for people and hear what the local community would like to see and how they would like to get involved and what they would like to have, you know, because quite often, if in a sort of consultation, people are crying out for allotments or, you know, a new school or something like that, or more shops or whatever, that can all be incorporated into the design. And then, as you said, you know, again previously, there's opportunity to add that kind of infrastructure, which otherwise might be missed.
I think COVID and the pandemic has actually been quite good for consultation because it's forced a lot of consultation to become digital as well as physical. Not to say that physical consultation should die out at all, but there's definitely statistics that digital consultation touches and reaches out to more parts of the community who aren't normally picked up, and so
particularly the younger generation.
Yeah, so it might be worth actually talking to one of those kind of platforms that engages with digital communication for you guys. So we work with a company called Commonplace, and they have it's worth actually talking to them. They've managed to turn people around. About 60% of people on an average kind of consultation can be turned around to having a negative or a positive view of development rather than, sorry, I didn't say that right, did I? I meant not negative. Just what's the word? Like
Positive?
No, like a kind of either, oh God.
Neutral.
Neutral, yeah. So either a neutral or positive impression of development rather than negative.
Yeah.
60% is a really good figure.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
So it'll be worth talking to those guys.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I mean, we
People side.
That's it. I mean, we do a lot of work with Davies White, which are landscape artists, you guys know as well. And they do a lot of sort of play design and sort of interactive design, traditionally more for kids and things, but they're doing a lot of urban design now. And we're doing, well, not so much urban design, but public realm design, which we're involved with them as well. And a lot of that, we've looked at things like VR and all of this type of thing, which was perfect timing because it was during COVID. So we were sort of able to drop people into, you know, a very, very simple scheme, which is kind of, you know, just lollipop trees and all that type of thing. But it gives people an idea of kind of the scale and what changes might be taking place. And whilst that's not large sort of new dwellings or developments or settlements, whatever, it's more people's streets. The engagement is totally different because it's so interesting to see how people actually use that space and engage with it, and how people was understanding changes. Because originally we did a lot of kind of the really high-end sort of almost like photoreal renders, which look really, impressive.
Yeah.
But people often see that as finished.
Yeah.
And then you get a really negative response in terms of community engagement because people are going, well, you haven't talked to us about this and you're putting this in. It's like, no, that's not what we're putting in. This is what it could be. This is your chance to kind of feedback. And they're like, well, we don't want that there. And they
it
sort of
definitely has
focus on
that
specific
sort of
things.
photorealistic does have its place.
Definitely, yeah.
I think a lot of what we do as a practice is that softer approach. We even though we do a lot of our work digitally, we've actually we are paperless and we do even our drawing is digital drawing, but it has a softer, more approachable feel to it. So even if we've actually worked it up to a lot of detail and there's a lot of background, robust work that's gone into it, it has a softer feel, which is very useful. But talking about a recent project actually of ours that last week actually got planning consent in quite a bit of an unprecedented way. Actually, it was a project we've been working on down in Dover for probably coming up to about a year. So it was on a draft allocated site outside Dover for approximately 110 dwellings. And we had engaged with a design review panel for this project. So we've done lots of consultation to really try and understand how to best bring this design forward. And our particular client on this project, they are very driven by design and quality. And even though we were looking at an outline application, we've actually kind of worked it out to really show how you can deliver a very, beautiful, great place. Took all that on board, it went to committee and it got refused on landscape grounds, despite having actually spent a lot of time on the landscape side of it and taking on board the design review panel thoughts and the local authority. And the case officer actually had been away during this committee decision and decided that this was the wrong decision to have taken and was, I guess maybe there's a bit of an embarrassment because it was a draft allocation. And anyway, so she decided that it would go back to committee 2 months later, which is a very quick turnaround. Before that, they didn't even issue the decision notice. They just said, no, it's going back to committee. We re-liaised with them on some issues that they wanted to kind of cover off in terms of landscape. We made changes to the layout and the master plan and the proposals to enhance landscaping further, increase more biodiversity, a reduction in some of the sort of massing of some of the proposals that we had. And going on to this, so we had lots of sketchy information which really gave that soft approach. But what was very successful
sketchy
in that,
as in drawn, not dodgy.
No, sketchy as in hand-drawn sketches. But we also engaged with CGI experts who did some photo montages of this landscaping in sort of a 1, 3, 5, 10-year process to kind of really demonstrate from more looking towards development, because there was some public rights of way nearby, how it would look. And in this instance, the CGI is actually what really won over the case because we could really strongly demonstrate that the additional landscaping that we'd proposed was really kind of nestling this development into the landscape. So it definitely has its place.
Definitely, yeah.
And the success story is that we did gain approval because of all those sort of changes that we made, and in a positive way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's part about knowing who your kind of audience is for whatever it is you're producing. So we did something quite similar on a project in London where we needed to provide all those sort of higher end visuals and things. And we did them in kind of a sketchy style as well, actually, funnily enough. And that went through and they were really pleased with it. But then some of the more community focused stuff, as I was saying, you kind of get people pick up on specific things maybe, or they don't understand that it's proposed. It's not exactly as it's gonna be. And it's kind of, that sort of hand-drawn, sketchy style, I think is really, really important because it gives that kind of unfinished look. And I think that's vital when you are talking to communities and people, because they understand that, these are just ideas, whereas some of the technology we use now is like, a lot of people may not have seen it before or come across it. And I think people can be quite shocked at how stuff can actually look, how good things can actually look. And then they sort of think, oh my God, it's so far done that that's what it must be.
There's a massive difference between drawing a straight line and a wiggly line.
Yeah.
Even if you're drawing by hand, the wiggly line is always going to be way softer and easier for people to engage with. We always kind of taught that if your grandma can understand it, if a child can understand it, then you're telling the story in the right way. Whereas if you're using too much jargon or drawing in a very technical way, it's much harder for the lay person to understand. And that's our job, communicating, isn't it?
Yeah. That's it. That's a really good point. So, so the next thing I wanted to sort of talk to you about really was, we've kind of covered a bit of the things we wanted to discuss around the importance of, or the value urban design can bring to kind of the environment and things as well. I don't know if you want to talk any more about that, anything on, designing for the environment within urban design?
I think it might be worth talking about a case study, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because I think when people think about designing for the environment and being sustainable, they think that it's about the technology and it's about those ologies and those things that you can add on to buildings and about the heat that buildings kind of let out. But actually, as urban designers, our responsibility, and landscape architects, is to start with that sustainability right from the outset. And that's not about the technology. That's about, is it easy to walk around the place? Is it easy to cycle? Is it in the right place? What's the percentage of green space? For example, there's loads of other kind of things that we should be thinking about. Are our streets orientated in the right direction? Are we making sure that we've protected the right bits of the landscape and the biodiversity? So we're working on a new settlement in Oxfordshire at the moment, and we've worked with Space Syntax and designed the master plan from the landscape up. All of the streets and spaces have been designed around views of the wider landscape and the AONB, which is quite exciting because it means that we're capturing amazing vistas and views that people have never seen before. So it's again going back to that, providing things that people haven't had access to. And we worked with Space Syntax and kind of rotated some of our streets like by 2 extra degrees in one direction to get them to kind of connect really well, and made sure that the street network that we've created is seamless, and that it's a kind of natural movement progression from the existing public rights of way and bridleways through the new town centre. And therefore, kind of what's the outcome of that? And the outcome has been that we've managed to design a place against the benchmark, which is currently Poundbury. So Poundbury is seen as being a very good place for movement for cyclists and pedestrians. So far, we are more walkable and more cyclable than Poundbury. And that kind of inherent sustainability from the outset is really, really important.
Because it's going to get people out of their cars and obviously use sustainable modes of transport.
But it's also making sure that a place is walkable, that it has a high walkability index, so that people don't make those really short trips to the shop or to a school, and everything that they need in that place is within their own settlement. And so really, really exciting. And that I don't think would have happened if we hadn't have had the pandemic. We've definitely pushed the design and progressed it, and it has 60% green space in a way that we never would have done 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So there are some really great outcomes that we can start to work with and push the boundaries even further. I think that's really exciting for our profession.
No, definitely. I think it's really important. I mean, I was listening to someone talk recently and they were saying, should we be designing for the electric car or should we be designing for no car? And actually, really, we should probably be designing for no car. It's all well and good replacing, all of the cars with electric, but we've still got all that infrastructure. There's still the energy that goes into that, and you won't have communities that are properly connected, and cities can be strangled by main roads and all this type of thing. So that's really important. It is kind of, how do we rethink the way we've used our cities and things in the past, and what do we want them to be for the future?
It's a very big part of our sustainability strategy for the new settlement, which is called Harrington, which I probably should have mentioned, in South Oxfordshire, is that we are designing phase by phase. So when the first phase is constructed, our kind of climate strategy will be to look at how it's performing as a place in that first phase. And then the next phase will be designed taking that on board. So rather than saying, let's design for no cars from the outset, perhaps we're designing for electric cars in phase 1, but as those phases progress, they may become no cars. And it's really important that we can test master planning in that way, so that we don't end up with those places that are designed 20 years ago and only just landing on the ground.
Yeah,
that's the thing, because Harrington is about 6,500 homes, isn't it, with schools, community facilities, doctor's surgery, high street, and mixed use. We should be under no illusion that that's going to take quite a long time to obviously come forward. So going back to the point we made earlier, that we might be designing for what is sustainable today. Technology will change in 5, 10, 20 years' time. So the approach of looking at it phase by phase and the adaptability in what's coming forward has to take that into account.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's interesting in terms of sort of, do you get involved much with sort of urban policy and things as well, of how settlements might be looked at in the future?
we don't really get that opportunity. I think as a profession we should do. We should be
Yeah.
working with local authorities to do that. But then you also have the risk of being in a place where you've got a client who wants to position something somewhere, and then you're looking at how a place should come forward, and there's that slight risk of kind of contradicting one another.
Yeah, the
or
conflict of
being
interest and
seen
all that type
that
of
you've
thing,
got
yeah.
two interests. Yeah, so it's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of work direct with local authorities. Despite there sometimes being a bit of a desire to do so, maybe not as much as there should be, but our work does sit predominantly on the private side.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a quick message from one of our sponsors, and it's that we're thrilled to announce that Marshalls is the sponsor of this episode. As the UK's leading supplier of sustainable concrete and natural stone products for the built environment, Marshalls is committed to doing the right things for the right reasons, delivered in the right way, ethically and sustainably. From fairly traded stone to low carbon concrete bricks, Marshalls believes we can create better spaces, putting people, communities and the environment first. Find out more about the firm's green initiatives in our podcast links below. So getting involved with kind of urban policy, I find it quite an interesting area because some cities are really sort of forward thinking with it. So somewhere I talk about a lot across the series, but in Singapore, they look at parts of the city and they have them on kind of 100-year, I think it's a 100-year lease. So every 100 years, they can essentially redesign that section of the city to meet the needs of the future because they know it will have completely changed within 100 years. And how do you keep that kind of regeneration going? How do you build better places that people want and respond to changes and factor in this new technology and things? And of course, that has a really high, potentially really high carbon footprint and all of this type of thing of consistently redeveloping. But if you're able to give people a better quality of life, if you're able to look at sort of the natural environment, incorporate better sort of landscape design, all of this type of thing as well, that's kind of one of those really difficult trade-offs as well, because there is obviously that challenge of sort of carbon and things, but also there's the social and biodiversity crises as well, and how you kind of marry it all together. So they're quite an interesting example in how they look at it. But they are a dictatorship, and they are the city is the country, so they have to be much more innovative. But I think it's something that comes up in conversation a lot lately. Even a farmer I've been working with, who does a lot on sort of what's the future of farming and how do we prepare for that, how we want our landscape to be and respond. Tim Hopkins, we have a short episode with him. Me and him have had a lot of talks in the pub about what is the future of cities, and we both sort of look at it going, well, actually, we think it has to be much denser. It has to be denser but much better designed, because then you have all your utilities and everything you need in a much smaller space. You can look at things like district heating easier, and public transport becomes much more effective, but you lose that ability to have your own house. You'd own a flat opposed to a house, and that does happen in a lot of other countries. And in Europe, but it's not really something that happens here.
I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to just historically how the planning system has worked in this country. We are a country with a lot of history that, rightly does need protecting. But I think what brings with that, and people's attitudes, but also, every country kind of residents in every country have their own sort of dream of what, what's the dream kind of property or place you want to live. You go to Australia and everyone wants a bungalow with a huge plot of land, but Australia also has a huge, vast amount of land to be able to deliver that. There is still obviously huge problems with then that kind of sprawl that you get. But then you look to Scandinavia and Northern Europe, Germany, that sort of thing. Actually, a lot of people live in flats, and that's not seen as something as a negative. Whereas I think flats in this country have a very negative connotation. I think
they absolutely
a lot of the flats were built in the 60s, sort of post-war. They're actually of very poor quality. Now they look horrendous. So I think the future of cities, and not just cities, is it's our towns and our villages as well, is that density is a big subject, and we need to be talking about building heights. I mean, we pretty much blanket cover this country in 2-story development. And, when someone talks about 2.5, it's like, wow, that's tall. And an example, so one of the first things we did as Edge, actually, on our day one, we were tour guides of London. For my uncle was head of a council, one of the municipalities outside of Stockholm in Sweden, and in his district they were in the process of proposing a new settlement. It's about 45 minutes outside the centre of Stockholm, and going a very different approach to how a lot of what happens in this country in development. They have already brought out the metro system to this place before they've even built the first home, so that when they do, it is immediately connected to those, those employment hubs. And despite this being in the middle of nowhere, typical sort of Scandinavian landscape, lots of lakes and woodland and forests and things to kind of contend with and build around and integrate, they were already proposing 17, 20-story buildings, so that ultimately the settlement actually eats up less of that natural environment and really densifies it and creates a central hub for a community with all those transport connections and all the other infrastructure and facilities that you need. And that's just a totally different approach to how we do things in this country. Yet we still look to Scandinavia and Northern Europe, and we look to some of the sort of Asian countries in terms of how they do it. And yes, Asia perhaps, has a different type of ruling system, so it's not completely comparable. But, Sweden, Norway, Denmark have been leading the way on sustainability for decades, yet we still can't seem to keep up with it. And there's a lot of...
I think it's because they have a design-led approach from the strategic planning level from the local authorities. So it's almost flipped. Yeah. Whereas here, the design-led approach comes from the private sector, not from the public sector. And I think if we switched it round, it would be a hell of a lot easier for us to deal with that.
It is difficult, because when you do want to try and push the boundaries a little bit from a placemaking, design, quality point of view, and all these new documentations, obviously the government are delivering on beautiful design and all that sort of thing, yet you then turn to individual local authorities' policies, and there's so many things in place that actually contradict what you're actually trying to do. And it becomes a huge battle. And then, of course, the process takes even longer, because even though you might maybe win the battle because they eventually come to see the positive side of the change, it's almost too little too late sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's kind of very much that business as usual kind of mentality we have. It's like,
and these policies were written 20, 30 years ago, and we're still sticking to them.
Yeah, exactly. No, I completely agree. I think one of the big challenges is how you build community in. I think that's one of the really interesting ones, because I spent quite a lot of time in Russia and in Belarus. I was in Belarus a couple of years ago. And what really surprised me there was you've got this Soviet tower blocks which look awful. As soon as I arrived, I thought I was going to get stabbed. Incredibly sort of dodgy. But actually, when you get up in the morning and went for a walk, there's people everywhere. It has like a totally different sense of community. You come out of the buildings and there's sort of all the grandmas sat there outside on the steps having a chat in the morning, going, "Oh, who's that guy?" Gossiping away. There's kids playing in the street. There's but the streets between the buildings are significantly landscaped, not well. A lot of it's very old and sort of dilapidated and run down, not really looked after properly. But they still have a lot of that kind of landscape. There's limited cars there in those areas. They're very, very limited parking. And they have to rely on sort of buses and trains and things. And that's been there for a very long time. But they seem to have got something right about the community side. And there seems to be that very strong sort of community of the kids all go outside and play together, and the older family members are there as well, keeping an eye on them, and everyone's kind of in this, more of a hub, as you say. And it's quite interesting when you see that. I don't know if it's just because of the density of people or not, but that it definitely is very different to the feel you get in a lot of sort of housing estates and places in this country.
Yeah, I agree.
I guess they've probably got more, in a way, deprivation than we have. In a way, sometimes when you do have a really hard time, it brings people together, a little bit like COVID. The community kind of really fosters and people start to look after each other a little bit more. Whereas we're in quite a privileged society in much of the UK, where it's more about what car you've got in your driveway or what your house looks like.
But COVID has changed that perception, I think. And I think, last year in particular, when there was the deep lockdown that we had, and the community spirit that I think was kind of came across the nation, really, that recognition in wanting to keep that going, I think in terms of placemaking terms and what we do, is therefore becoming even greater, and a greater understanding from locals as well, so that when we now go forward and we'll be doing consultation on things, they will have a greater appreciation for it, and they'll want it more because they've kind of seen that side of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's what's really interesting about this point in time is it's kind of coming from all sides. So you've kind of got the climate change thing. We know we need to green cities and make them healthier and all this type of thing. Then there's the health side where you've got the NHS looking at like preventative health care and lots of evidence around air pollution and reduction in that and flooding, all of those type of things. But then you've also got this sort of societal issues, and people know that we need to build better communities, and you see it in sort of the crime in London. A lot of that has gone back to a lack of sort of community funding and community policing and all that type of thing. So all of it is kind of shifting around to this kind of, we've got to rethink the environment in which we live in, and it totally makes sense. If you've got a bad environment to live in, you're going to be disgruntled, angry. You're going to have more various issues. Whereas if you're in a much nicer place to live, then you've got much more chance to engage and do more.
And I think we were having this conversation last week about, you were sort of saying about a lot of the other individuals and people you've spoken to as part of this series, very environmentally driven. And there's that sort of concern, we're coming in talking about building, which is a lot of what we do because it's about making places. And I think people's perception about climate change and making the world better, a lot of it comes down to, protection of the environment and all that sort of thing. But talking about, going back to your Harrington example, to reduce people's car usage, which is a huge, puts a huge pressure on, the carbon footprint, unless we actually design places that allow for less car usage, and this is only one small part of all of it, but that is such a big part of what we do. So that is where our role is so important in, what might be seen as the bigger things that would drive climate change and improving the natural world. But you need to think about all those interconnecting things as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And part of the reason, therefore, that starting afresh with a new settlement rather than extending places that have already grown too much, the benefit of that being that you almost take a bigger risk because you're probably looking at land that has a very low value but very little chance of gaining a planning permission or planning approval. And therefore, actually, because that land value is lower from the outset, it gives us the opportunity to do things properly, which we can't necessarily do on a site that has got like the hope value because it sits on the edge of a ring road adjoining a site that's just been approved. You're never going to be able to put in the infrastructure and the sustainability and the landscape space in that kind of site compared with something that is actually a bigger risk that gives you that chance to create a story and a narrative. And that's part of our role, I think, to think outside the box and say, okay, it would be much easier to put 500 houses here on the edge of Basingstoke. However, we could also look at doing X, Y, and Z and create something really special that's going to be a bit more of a risk, but it might change the way that people start to live or the way that they think about building new homes and new communities, which is exciting for us.
It definitely is. Definitely is. Well, it's one of those things, isn't it? That's where people live, and people are going to have somewhere to live, and it's designing that well is really important. But it is a huge challenge. We were saying about perspectives and people's view of these things. I think people do realise that we need to readdress sort of the urban realm. We see it a lot now. With it, who is it? Insulate Britain, for example. A huge percentage, I can't remember the percentage, but it's a ridiculous amount of the UK housing stock is crap. And actually, is there an opportunity there to kind of look at it and go, well, do we just insulate the houses or do we actually look at that area as a whole? But then there's this real challenge of how on earth do you do that when everyone owns their own home? It sort of removes an aspect of sort of resilience there, which you could have if you were able to look at these things in a different way. But I think it's a problem with everything in a way as well, because we have a lot of, even on enhancement programs where we're not removing sort of areas which could be considered the environment and building on it. We've got a project where we're doing a lot of enhancement. We're restructuring part of a river, we're putting new wetlands in, we're improving the grasslands there to make them more diverse because they're very limited. And this is a project we've been involved with the council and with ecology companies and lots of consultancies going, actually, this area is really not very good. There's a huge amount we can do to enhance it, to protect the city from flooding, to make it more accessible for people to get out into the countryside. And we've sort of proposed this project. And when it started on the ground, we had people laying in front of the mowers and the machinery to do it, saying, you know, we're here to protect nature. And it's like, well, actually, nature's so deprived that actually there's not really anything here. You know, if you actually want to, you know, we have an opportunity to enhance it, you know, improving people's lives, the city, and nature. You know, people, place, and nature. It's all about that. But people still don't understand that. They still very much see a tree being cut down as negative. Whereas, you know, it's sad that tree's been cut down. It would be better if we could leave it. But if removing those few trees means we can create a whole new area of wildflower meadows and plant more trees elsewhere and create wetlands and things, you know, it is a sacrifice that, you know, in my view, is worth it. But it has to be done in a, you know, a logical way. And we're not out there to do, you know, make money from all these things and do all of this stuff. And it's the same with housing. It's an urban design. It's kind of, you know, trying to find the best outcome for everybody and everything. And there's so much opportunity to do that, but people, you know, they don't necessarily realise that those opportunities are there.
I think there is a huge lack of education around all that. And I'm just even taking it from a very small example from my 7-year-old son last week. We were driving along the motorway and he just pointed out, they've cut some trees down. And he was really upset by the fact that they'd cut some trees down. And of course, you know, it's a glimpsed moment, and I couldn't really comment much on that, when maybe they were planting them somewhere else. But so clearly he's had this message told him that cutting down trees is bad. And of course, cutting down trees isn't good. But like you say, there are often vast other reasons behind that. You know, this is not akin to deforestation, clearly.
Exactly,
but,
yeah.
You know, like you say, you can create even better environmental assets because you provide space for something else, or, you know, one may have been cut down and 10 have been planted elsewhere. But so, you know, so even as a 7-year-old, suddenly there's this perception that this is bad, and I'm not advocating that it's good, but there's a missing link somewhere in what else actually could be happening.
Absolutely.
I'd guess it's probably not just education, but communication. So it needs to come from both sides, doesn't it? From the public sector and, you know, into education.
That's it.
Yeah.
To all kind of walks of life, not just to kids. Obviously, they're the younger generation, so we need to kind of teach them properly.
That's it. Well, that's the trouble, I think, with the media at the moment, really, is you only really ever get one side of the story, and it's always, this is bad.
Yeah.
And there's no kind of explanation as to the challenges behind what's happening and the reasons behind it. And it's not a case of just yes or no. Actually, it's a huge mire of, you know, caveats and, you know, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but, you know, where you sort of offset here and offset there and all that type of thing. You know, it's never that simple, especially when it comes to the environment. It's very, very complicated, but because there's often so many people involved, so many things to consider. And, you know, we get it all the time. And we had an episode with Dougal Driver, who's from Grown in Britain. And he was basically saying that, you know, you look at a field and a farmer cutting the wheat, and a child comes home from his summer holiday, and they draw a picture, and it's of a farmer cutting some wheat in a field, and everyone goes, oh wow, that's amazing. And the next child comes in and draws a picture of a harvester harvesting the woodland next to it, and they go, oh my God, this is horrible. And then the mum sees it and she writes a complaint to the council saying they're cutting all these trees down. And actually, really, it's the same thing. Forestry is just, you know, longer farming, basically. Tree farming, but there's that kind of really misnarrative around all the benefits that those trees can provide and all of this type of thing, and that wood's going to be used, you know. But again, people are so disconnected; they don't necessarily understand that. And I think that's why we wanted to put this series together, is because there is so many sort of misconceptions out there, and people don't understand how and why we approach things and do things the way we do. We wanted to try and share that. And share it, you know, a more holistic view of the environment in general.
Yeah, the reality behind all of
exactly
this.
The reality of it, not just people there going, we need to save the environment, which we all obviously want to do. It's just there are a lot of challenges and reason and trade. That's the word I was looking for. Trade-offs. There's a lot of trade-offs in delivering. You know, you might have to give something more here, give something less there, and you know, you have to apply that over the whole area you're looking at, or whatever it is you're doing, policy or whatever.
It's a balance, isn't it?
Yeah, balance, that's the word. That's a better word.
And I think we've got a very romanticised view of farming in the UK, you know, that it's that old traditional way of living, but it's not necessarily the case, is it?
Yeah, that's it. But then, you know, again, you know, I don't want to talk too much on the tree side, but, you know, there is kind of this view that we just afforest everything. And it's kind of like, well, and again, on the farmer side, where on earth our food going to come from? And it's far better we grow it here than we bring it in. And, you know, we want a mosaic of habitats, not just trees everywhere. You know, and again, that's something that people don't often understand. They think the UK was always forested, and actually it probably wasn't. It was a mosaic of habitats which we lost, due to humans eating everything.
And
so
the balance of woodland, it's really important to maintain those woodlands and take out trees that are perhaps damaging other species or to get more light.
Limiting the healthy ones,
Yeah, exactly. And letting light to the forest floor and all this type of thing. So there's a huge range of things that need to be done there. It's just, as I say, it's not always something people are so aware of.
Yeah.
So I think the next thing we could talk a bit about was your practice. So you have an all-female practice, which is really interesting, really exciting. And obviously you set up not that long. We set up actually, I think you set up just before we did.
Yeah.
And then obviously we all faced COVID. So how was it setting up your business? How have you found things, and how did you guys find and survive COVID?
So we are an all-lady business, not by design necessarily. I think what we have found is that because there are 2 female directors of the business, other ladies within the industry have kind of pushed back on what used to be very male-dominated and seen 2 female directors and been very attracted to that. And so that kind of girl power has really kind of pulled together. But we absolutely love to have some men in the team. So just put that out there. And we set up the business because we wanted to create something fresh and vibrant and friendly and colourful, and a business that was good at communicating and taking people on the journey with us, and really to try and do what we do in a completely different way. So for us, the business is actually very much about our brand and our voice, and how we can empower and inspire people, whether that be our team or our clients or the general public. So actually, it's really interesting because it's definitely not a business that's based on what we do per se, but it's about the kind of the story.
But what we do very well. Yeah. We should add that.
It's about the kind of story and the vibe and the way that the team comes together and what we can do to make people kind of feel alive. So that's very much what our business is about. It's more about the why rather than the what we do. So COVID, over to you. You can do the COVID bit.
Well, and I think building on what you just said, Hannah, is that the testament to our team that we now have has been created in COVID. So up until March last year, so we're just over 3 years old now. So up until March last year, 18 months in, it was just Hannah and I. 2 weeks before lockdown, we took on 2 new members of the team. We took on an office, and then lockdown happened. And from our point of view, it couldn't have happened at a worse time. But being a young business and having these initial 2 members who were, to really give them credit, were very adaptable to the kind of sudden change that we had to move with. We were agile in how we even just set up our own kind of working practices, despite having got an office and now being chucked out. But we've then grown after a couple of, I'm sure you experienced, the first couple of months were quite difficult. The industry basically came to a halt. It came down to both the actual construction industry itself and local authorities. There was a mixture of those two. But when confidence picked up for us, we've been on an upwards trajectory ever since, and hence why our team has grown. But we've had to continue this attitude to how we are as a business, how we portray ourselves externally and internally in a virtual way, because we've had this whole upheaval with obviously not being able to be together because of COVID. And, it's testament to our team really, and being able to kind of really pull that through. And I really think we believe that if we can get through what we've got through at such an early stage of our business and go from strength to strength, we can sort of make it through anything. And again, going back to what Hannah said about how I think we have attracted various, the females that are in our business. They've just kind of obviously really felt something that we're doing, which is different. And so we're already off on the right foot, really, when they've joined. And we've had to be innovative in how we do things. Not everything always works, but we are also flexible and don't dwell on things that perhaps don't work out so well. Just take it as a learning point and move on and try the next thing. And I think, a lot of the people we work with, our clients, have appreciated that as well. We're very open, we're very honest, we're always there. And despite having a team now, we're very heavily involved in everything we do on a day-to-day basis. So there's a continuity in terms of, from our client side, who they're working with, who they're dealing with, and there's a trust. We've instilled that trust in them that, yes, we're now a bigger team and we're growing and we're looking to continue to expand. And that's by virtue of their trust in us and changing the types of projects that we're getting involved in, and really showcasing our ability in all that.
Yeah, it's very much been about relationships all the way through. So relationships with clients, relationships with professionals, other consultants, teaming up, working together, collaborating, relationships with our team. And I think actually being virtual has enhanced a lot of that. You know, we've made some great friends through things like business coaching sessions that were all online. And suddenly you feel like you know everything about that person because you've seen inside their house, you know what they've got in their kitchen. So relationships have been really key. I think that's a great thing that everyone can learn from the pandemic, you know, to keep building that, because it does create that trust. You know, you want to work with your friends.
Yeah,
I think that's what we're all doing now.
Yeah, I think you're right. What I found is it's all become very human. Things have become much more human than I think they ever were, because you always had that kind of perception when you went to a meeting where it was all business and everyone was there with their notes here to say exactly what they were going to say, and that was kind of it. Whereas now you have those kind of almost informal Zoom. Oh, should we just have a quick chat? Yeah, go on then. We'll just have a quick chat, and you chat for 5 minutes, and you end up spending 4 of those minutes
and
talking
is almost
about
sharing
something
those
else.
struggles, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everyone's had issues. You know, people have lost people, which has meant people have been a bit more vulnerable than perhaps they normally would have been. You see the dog come bounding into the back of the room and knock over the tea or something like that, and the kids come in screaming. You know, I've just had a newborn. You know, quite often my wife comes in, oh, I'll take it, and I'm in the middle of a meeting and I end up stuck with a crying baby in the middle of the meeting going, oh no, you know, quickly putting on mute. But it really has changed the way we look at things. And I think you're right. It's more like you're working with friends now than I think perhaps it kind of ever was before, in a way, when it comes to sort of consultant teams and things. And people are much more open, which I think is really nice. And I hope that really continues.
Yeah.
Because I think it's, yeah.
One thing I've really loved is that normally, previously, say 3 years ago, if you asked somebody out to a networking event, they would always make sure that they were there. Like, I'll be there, because it's really important and we're doing business. But now you quite often get people saying, I'm really sorry, I can't come because it's my turn to look after the kids.
Yeah.
And it's just like that humanity is absolutely lovely. And I just always think that would never have happened 3 years ago.
I agree.
Because people would have looked down on you. There'd have been that perception of, oh, why are you not kind of putting your business first? Why are you putting your family first?
That's it.
And now we can do that. And we can kind of do business with levity and humour and like compassion, which is so much nicer.
That's it, yeah.
And I think something that we've always tried to do and play really hard on is also like celebrating both the little and the big things, and not just even celebrating our things within our business, but we'll happily celebrate and showcase other people and businesses, because I think there's nothing like lifting each other up in what we're doing. You know, if you want to work with friends and you want to kind of be in a sort of a joyful environment, why do we hold back on actually talking about what other people are achieving as well? And I don't think that's hindered our success and our ability to you know, whether it's, I don't think there's a problem in talking about what other people are doing, even if they're competitors of ours.
Well, I agree. I think times have changed so much, you know, and again, partly because of COVID, it's kind of a bit more human and people are a bit more invested in one another than perhaps they would have been. Also, a lot more people have set up on their own. So whereas before you had a lot of big sort of quite more corporate companies, now you've got lots of small little companies with just a few people, you know, 1, 2, maybe 5 people, which I think by virtue are just more welcoming and more open in a way, because they don't have that kind of the pressures of a big kind of multidisciplinary, multi-corporate practice, which is really nice. And I think the other thing which has happened, especially for my practice, is 90% of our work is with other landscape practices and other people in the profession. And that's partly because, you know, we have skills, sort of newer technology skills that a lot of some of the older generation don't have, but also because there's such a shortage of people, we have to lean on each other a lot more. You know, and we found that really nice as being a new practice. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we were invited to a sort of big celebration for one of our partners, which is Tim Moore Associates. And they were really nice to invite all of us and our families down to a, you know, work party down in Cambridge. And they bought us all dinner and everything and treated all of us. It wasn't just a case of saying, oh, why don't bring your family, just you come, like it kind of would have been in the past. And we got there and all their families were there, all the kids were there. They even had some previous employees that had left over COVID and all this type of thing come along, and they just had a really nice kind of get together. And I think that's what's changing. A lot of companies I've spoken to lately, when they talk about their Christmas do, it's not their company, it's kind of the range of people they work with, and it's kind of like even some of their competitors, but they're still friends with them. They come and, because I think there is kind of a lot more respect between especially the smaller practices around, people's clients and things like that, and the relationships you build. And now, we are looking to sort of lean on each other more and more because we have to, I think, as well.
It's that sense of we're in it together.
Yeah.
It's no longer about competition, it's about collaboration.
Absolutely, yeah.
And thank goodness.
Yeah.
There's way less ego and much more
definitely.
teamwork, which is great.
There is, absolutely. And I think also it's partly because of the time we're in. We know we've got to get round to fixing the crises that we're facing because, they're only getting worse. And if we don't work together and we don't push things forward, then it's much more difficult. I mean, we find it a lot with some of those we work with. We try and bring in the really heavy hitters that are very, very senior in their area into projects, even small projects, just to say, no, this is not the right way to do it, because they kind of have the authority to say it. Whereas I think before they wouldn't have really been involved because it's your project, Whereas now it's kind of actually, we know what we should be doing, and there are some of these barriers in the way where developers might not want to do things, or there's restrictions in terms of policy. And actually, if you can bring these people in that were involved in writing some of that policy or whatever else, to sort of say, actually, no, that's not how we should be doing it. We should be doing it like this. People realize that, but they may not have the confidence to kind of do it because they've not come across it before. So it's kind of about opening those doors for each other as well and bringing people in. And some projects are also really big, and you need a range of expertise and you need support. You can't do it by yourself, especially if you're a small business. So it's about identifying those opportunities and working together too.
Comes back to balance again.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Teamwork.
That's it. So well, thank you both very much for.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, joining me today.
Really interesting to have that discussion as well and kind of get all of that out in the open, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's great stuff.
It is. It's so important. I think it's important that people hear, what's really going on and what people really think and what challenges and opportunities there are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And see you again soon, hopefully.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. Here's a quick message from one of our sponsors. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead, with remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows. Sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks Landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in finding out more about the urban environment and how we can look to green it, then check out our episode with Dusty Gedge. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to friends and colleagues who might be interested in this series. We really need help to be able to grow. And a massive thank you for our sponsors, Marshalls and Vectorworks, for making this episode possible, our kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and of course, NDLA and Monster Don for powering this episode.